Pablo Matera, Pumas former captain, Jaguares former captain, one of the best loose forwards in the world, is joining one of the best rugby teams in the world as of next year. He is signing for the Crusaders. This was the news out yesterday. Now, it has been speculated for quite some time that Pablo has had his eyes on a Super Rugby team. Interestingly, a lot of the speculation was pointing towards some of the Australian teams, with the Waratahs looking to be the most likely of the candidates. And it's been a fairly common thing for Argentinian players to join some of the Australian teams in the past. Kubeli has been in Australia a couple of times now. There's a few guys at the Force, the Rebels as well. So yeah, it's a bit of an interesting one that he's joining not only a New Zealand team, but the Crusaders. Now, that's not an easy team to kind of get into. They tend to kind of promote their own players internally, such as the conveyor belt of young, talented players that come through that part of the country. But he is a hell of a player, and he is joining a hell of a team. So, yes, it's only a one-year deal. It's not exactly like a long-term gig for Pablo. He will be joining for the 2022 season. Once he is done with Stade Francais in France, he'll be joining up with the Crusaders. The Crusaders CEO said he was keen to be playing Super Rugby, and that they still are working through some of the details with Pablo. Another news source, I think it was Stuff, reported that the deal has to go through New Zealand Rugby, because essentially the New Zealand Super Rugby teams are set up to breed and develop New Zealand players. So there's a small quota you're allowed to have for foreign players. Michael Alatoa is one of those at the moment. He would have been New Zealand eligible at one point in his career, but he eventually played for Samoa, so he becomes one of those kind of quota players. He's going to Leinster, so that opens up a spot for the Crusaders to sign Pablo. But obviously it's that matter of he's taking the spot of a potential New Zealand player. But New Zealand Rugby was apparently still pretty keen to get the deal done. And yeah, like I said, they're working through the details of it. But he is going to be signing. Now, he's had a heap of experience in Super Rugby with the Jaguares. Remember, took them to a final. He was probably the best player in Super Rugby in that 2019 season. He was just having the time of his life. Didn't quite replicate it for the Pumas, but at Super Rugby level, he was just phenomenal. And then more recently, led the Pumas to their first ever victory over the All Blacks in a pretty famous victory. So, yeah, he's definitely a big name player. And it does come with a touch of controversy, which followed up that famous All Blacks victory, which was the matter of the historical racist tweets, which he has apologized for. But yeah, it seems like the Crusaders aren't really afraid of that bit of controversy. You remember it was a couple of years ago they signed Sevu Reece. He was due to go to Ireland to play for Connacht, but with some domestic violence case, he ended up having his deal terminated with them, but then the Crusaders still picked him up. So they're not afraid to pick up a player if the talent is there, despite the kind of controversy that comes associated with that. Now, you guys all have your own opinions on whether you can be a reformed racist, or whether once a racist, always a racist and whatnot. But you can't doubt his abilities on the field. And yeah, the Crusaders, like I mentioned, aren't letting that get in the way of things. So yeah, he'll certainly bring experience. Scott Robertson was saying he's a premier loose forward, skillful. He'll bring leadership and share his experience with some of the younger players. So yeah, I guess in the absence of the likes of Kieran Reid, who's finished with the Crusaders, Matt Todd left. You know, they do have a fairly young, loose forward set of players. So it'll be good to have Matera there. In terms of the experience, he's been around the block. He's kind of done a bit of a James Haskell and trying all the different leagues. You know, Haskell went to France and, played in Super Rugby with the Highlanders and played in England. I mean, he played in Japan as well. Matera hasn't had the Japanese gig, but he's been in England, France, and he's done the Super Rugby thing as well. So now he's coming over to New Zealand to try his hand. I would imagine he'll be a pretty successful addition to the Crusaders lineup. It'll be interesting to see if Scott Robertson sorts out a contract for 22, because he's only on a one-year deal at the moment. But yeah, it's a big deal. So yeah, Crusaders get another player, and like I said, it's not a common thing for the Crusaders to sign big name players. It's really unusual for them. They usually bring them up through themselves. Like the Blues were more likely to sign like a Bowden Barrett, from another team. It just doesn't seem to happen. I mean, the Highlanders had Jimeno. It's not a really done thing. Any year you look at the Crusaders transfers, it's always a pretty stable lineup, so it is kind of a big deal. But anyway, you guys let me know your thoughts. How do you reckon Pablo's going to go? Are you kind of excited to see him playing in New Zealand rugby? Do you think the controversy thing will do any harm to New Zealand rugby's image, or do you think you kind of need to let bygones be bygones? You guys let me know your thoughts, and I'll talk to you again soon. See you later.